Hello everybody. welcome, welcome back. So today we're gonna talk about magical creatures, which is actually QRI's new line of scents about consciousness. So there are gonna be scents that will help you explore the state space of consciousness in new, significant, meaningful, and non-trivial ways. So, I'm very excited to talk about this. First of all, the quality of the day is helpful, skillful, imaginary beings. They also call them tulpas, essentially, like imaginary friends that are good. They're good for you. Most imaginary beings that we tend to create are not very good for us, right? Like we imagine like wrathful, unpleasant, personifications of ideas and cultures, even countries, and of course like the very demons that we have, whoever has criticized you, or even yourself, your super ego and so on. And a lot of those tulpas are not necessarily very helpful. They're actually there to kind of like make you feel bad in one way or another. Well, it doesn't have to be like that. You can imagine, something like the ideal parental figure, the parents you never had, but you wish you had, that are always supportive and helpful and loving. And likewise, you can kind of extend and generalize this concept, right? Like entities that, maybe in the classical sense of something like tulpa practice in Buddhism, that will help you unlock an understanding about the fundamental nature of reality, and as such, reduce your suffering, among other things. But you can generalize this even further, talk about helpful beings that will disclose properties of consciousness that, of course, they could be used to reduce suffering, but maybe they're like interesting powers. They have capacities that are empowering to the mind, for the imagination, enrich and vivify positive, useful, helpful fantasies of consciousness. Well, that's what we're gonna talk about today, and in fact, the scents that I'm gonna present to you, and that we are showcasing and actually making available in exchange of donations to QRI, are kind of like modeled with that in mind. Essentially, they are personifications of states of consciousness that are helpful, highlight powerful, interesting, fascinating facets of consciousness. So let me begin here to explain what is the philosophy of perfume, a fragrance at QRI. There's like so many fragrances out there, so many fragrant houses, so many people, so many perfumists, right? And everybody has kind of like a different approach, a different way of thinking about it. So I think, based off of Robert Bia's, Jana retreat, which I talked about in the previous video, intentions make our worlds, and that is not hyperbole. I mean, essentially, the intention with which you approach a particular practice, investigation, or relationship will have enormous effects on what actually manifests, what arises, what unfolds and gets disclosed. So I would claim actually that a lot of art and perfume, in fact, is quite limited because of the intention with which they are approached. So, 2020, 2019, I believe, published an essay about 8 models of art. You can find it in this magazine, Art Against Art, issue number 6. You can find it online and buy it. This is the article. You can see it's called Harmonic Society, 8 Models of Art for a scientific paradigm of aesthetic qualia. So in it, I essentially talk about 8 models of art. The first one is kind of this idea that art is whatever you can get away with. Semantic deflation. There's no such thing as art, and essentially it's up for grabs. If you have that intention, you will make some provocative and interesting, artistic statements, but not taking seriously the potential will, in some sense, limit what's going to be produced. Model number 2 is art as kind of weapons of seduction. It's the same in perfume, right? It's like eau sauvage is something that, of course, you can only afford if you're wealthy. You can spare money, whatever. Is a signaling tool. And sure, that has its place. It can be interesting, fun, erotic, sexy, whatever it may be, but it's limited, right? Because it has that intention of dating or kind of presenting yourself in a certain way. And I'm very cognizant of, holding a strange allure. Of course, some intention to present myself in a particular way, but we'll get to that. So that's the second model, and I think it's quite limited. A lot of people, that's all they do when it comes to art, buying $10 million art pieces to show your friends that you can afford it, something like that, impress people. The third model is art as kind of the creation of niche spaces, new cultural spaces where the rules are different. You don't necessarily abide by mainstream society, and that is interesting. You create a new cultural landscape where kind of the values are different. And I think that also is very helpful, but also is kind of limited, right? You're not necessarily getting the most out of it. And then you have art as the creation of sacred experiences, the mystical approach to art. And I think that's very beautiful, of course. But likewise, I think is somewhat limited because the things that will get disclosed will essentially be constrained by your conception of the mystical. And maybe actually the mystical is much deeper and richer than you can imagine. Your expectations will shape what unfolds. So that's why I essentially presented 4 new models of art, which are actually based on exploring and understanding the state space of consciousness and everything that it has to offer. So the 5th model is, very, very clearly, art as the exploration of the state space of consciousness, very explicit. And that is, one lens and is very, very helpful. But if that's all you're doing, you could, in a sense, like the Library of Babel for art pieces, some kind of every possible, pixel configuration on a screen. Well, the vast majority of those will be meaningless, right? Insignificant, random. They look the same from our point of view. So you've got to explore the state space of consciousness using clever, intelligent heuristics, and that's how you will get essentially to find much more interesting things in it. Then model number 6 is art as things that modulate the energy parameter of consciousness. And the most straightforward example of something that modulates the energy parameter are things such as, the volume or brightness of things. But, from a neuroscientific perspective and involving something like predictive coding and the free energy principle, the unexpected, whatever is surprising actually, will function as a energizer, right? So, for example, what I did at the beginning of, I believe it was my video on free will, if you're curious, the Qualia of the day. Check that out. Yeah, but for example, that would be an example of that. So, art as modulating the energy parameter, whatever is surprising is a multiplier of the energy. And so, it's not the case that surprise is necessarily positive or negative. Actually, surprising stimuli will multiply the energy of the intrinsic valence of the stimuli, right? So something very unpleasant that is surprising will be extra unpleasant, right? Because it's being multiplied by that surprise. Um, but even that conception is kind of limited because there are like even more interesting emergent effects, that you can use, that you can identify. Um, and so number 7 is art as annealing effects. And here's where, I would encourage you to look into neural annealing, either my presentations or, articles that have been written in the context of QRI about neural annealing. Uh, easy to find on Google, or on YouTube. And essentially, we get stuck into repetitive neurotic patterns of consciousness and patterns of thinking because of stored stress that kind of like make our attention be trapped, and it bounces off from one stressful state to another stressful state. By raising the energy parameter and then, very importantly, letting it cool with equanimity and let it cool slowly, you can experience neural annealing, where essentially you undo the internal patterns of stress by kind of like massaging them away. And I think a lot of art is doing this. It's a very powerful effect. If you go to Burning Man or Ephemeral or like one of these transformative festivals, or indeed if you actually do a meditation retreat, it's not just that it enhances your energy parameter, you also experience neural annealing effects, because kind of the repeated exposure to really unlikely states of consciousness raises your energy, and then you're in a context where that energy doesn't really have anywhere to go, so it becomes what we call semantically neutral energy. And that activates your native harmonics, as opposed to activating whatever stressful patterns of nonlinearities have been accumulating over the years. So a lot of like really high-grade art, I think, really gets into that territory. But then, the 8th model is harmonic society. Is this idea that a scientific understanding of all of these principles will allow us to essentially arrive at what I later called the aesthetic of the meta-aesthetic, which is having such a fine-grained understanding of how different aesthetics are interfacing with particular landscapes of valence that you can essentially kind of create a map where the adjacent aesthetics are really consonant with each other. It's kind of like there are, for example, songs, let's say 2 songs that are very beautiful on their own, but if you transition from one to the other, there's going to be a very jarring in-between state, right? So harmonic society would be a scientific understanding of aesthetics that is so deep and rich that you can go from any aesthetic to any aesthetic by finding a path in between that is always harmonious and always wholesome, always produces good annealing effects. So that would be kind of like, what I think maybe my current conception of the ultimate conception of something, kind of the potential of art. So kind of like apply this idea, right? Like that if you approach art with kind of this enriched, expanded, conceptual framework and set of intentions, you will get so much more out of it, right? Like if you go to a conceptual art exhibit and you have this expanded conception of art, it will be so much more impactful, so much more beautiful, so much more deep. And, transpose this to something like approaching a jhana retreat, as I talked about in the previous video. And Robert Bia, talks a lot about this, which is if you go to a jhana retreat just trying to learn how to be calm, how to be relaxed, that's going to be very limiting. There are depths of consciousness that are just not going to unfold that way. Or, if you go to a jhana retreat because you like the teacher, or you want to tick the box of, yes, I went to a jhana retreat, or you want to decorate the ego by saying, yes, I can achieve XYZ jhana or something like that, that also is going to prevent some unfoldings, some openings that are going to be very, very profound if you allow them to happen. At QRI, we are very, very bullish on the idea that psychedelic retreats, both, on the scientific front and on the spiritual front, are very limiting for that reason. Because if you go to, let's say, an ayahuasca retreat nowadays, in Brazil or Mexico or whatever it may be, what happens is that you will be administered the quote-unquote medicine within a spiritual framework that is already kind of like predetermined. And there's going to be some expectations about what is it that it's supposed to do, right? Like, oh, like there's like spirits, or maybe it connects you to the Holy Ghost, whatever it may be, right? That conceptual framework, I think, is rather limiting. Or, if you think about it just from a kind of like standard mainstream neuroscientific point of view, you take ayahuasca and you go into it by thinking, well, this is going to disable my default mode network and allow my global workspace to essentially access egoless states of consciousness or something like that. Well, that too, actually, subtly, but very, very significantly, is going to be limiting what is it that you can experience. So, Robert Brea suggested, go to a jhana retreat with the intention of deeply mastering jhanas in their own terms. Let them have a big impact on the being. And likewise, go to an ayahuasca retreat with the intention of understanding those states of consciousness in their own terms and derive both an experiential and intellectual acquaintance with them, familiarity with them, that allows them to disclose whatever they have to teach you. And not only at a personal level, it's not only like, in what ways, you were bad to your mother, in what ways your boss was traumatizing, whatever it may be. It's not, don't think of it just in those terms. Think of it also in the terms of, what can I learn that I can share with others so that we understand consciousness better, right? So that's kind of the very radical, open-ended approach that I think is the most helpful. So let's transpose all of these, understanding of the power of intentions to perfumery. Well, even before then, so a conceptual framework that I am very excited about, that kind of encapsulates what I think is a very wholesome, very powerful way of exploring the state space of consciousness, is what I've come to talk about as Qualia mastery. So Qualia mastery contains 3 facets, as if it was itself, a perfume of the mind. The first facet of Qualia mastery is that you do it for the benefit of all sentient beings. This is not just to decorate the ego, as I was saying, is not, for your pride, is not for your country even, or something like that. It's not like competing in the Olympics, where like the goal is limited. It's like, yes, I was the best Mexican at, front on, at risk, whatever it may be. It doesn't matter. No. The idea is, let's find information that will be helpful for the collective, the collective of consciousness, all of consciousness, all sentient beings. Perhaps not even in this universe alone, but in the multiverse, kind of like this very radical sense of skin in the game for consciousness. So that's like the first facet. The second one is to develop an intimate, experiential understanding of consciousness, to be able to instantiate all of these facets, know them deeply for yourself, not just from afar, but like actually know what, the mystics or the artists, the scientists are talking about. Know it for yourself. And then the third one is developing an intellectual understanding. You've got to have a sharp mind as well, to develop the vocabulary, develop the conceptual frameworks, the fluidity of mind, to be able to talk about these things and not just get stuck in thinking about it as ineffable. And sure, there's some recipes for particular states of consciousness that benefit from kind of like having, surrendering to the mystery, to saying, I cannot understand this, this is beyond words. And that has its place, but I think that's just a mode. That's an approach, is an aesthetic, is a lens. But I think it's your birthright to not only experience things for yourself, but also understand them. And I think that's actually very, 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 very valuable. And I am not of the mind of kind of this, this is just beyond words. We're never going to get to understand it. No. I think that's giving up too early. Let's cultivate the virtue that I call epistemological optimism. That wherever other people have failed in the past, when it comes to be able to describe and make sense of experiences, maybe we can succeed. So that is Qualia mastery. To recap, is for the benefit of all sentient beings, very important. Second, to develop an experiential, personal intimacy with the state space of consciousness is your birthright. And third, cultivate an intellectual understanding. So with that intention, approaching something that may sound as trivial as perfumery, all of a sudden gives you so much more. So with all of that said, what intention, what approach am I going to cultivate here when it comes to the QRI approach to sense? Well, the truth is there are many, and I think very valuable, very insightful ways of approaching sense. But the one that I thought would be very empowering and beautiful would be as the first line of sense, which is very different than, as far as I know it, how others have approached this problem is magical creatures. In other words, okay, why? So first of all, as you can, see from the QRI logo, this is what's called the CLab color space. It turns out that if you do, in psychophysics, you present, shades of various colors in a computer. Let's say one color in the left, one color in the right, and you ask participants, are they the same or different? You can get what's called a just noticeable difference as your unit of distance. So, and you can define that as, for example, 75% of the time, people say that they are different or something like that. That's kind of like a threshold. Ultimately, there's no hard boundary. You have to decide it yourself. But let's say you pick something like 75%. Well, if you use that as your measuring rod, and you start computing all of the distances, every pair of colors that are one just noticeable distance away, and you put them in a graph, and you try to embed that graph in some geometric space, it turns out it will be a 3D Euclidean space, which has 3 axes. So the first one, the trivial one, is just how bright it is. That's going to from black to white. But then there's like 2 other ones, which is yellow and blue, which are quote unquote opposites. I mean, this is kind of clear when you look at something very, very yellow and then you close your eyes and you see a blue after image. And then you also have the red-green axis, the Christmas axis. I think like Christmas, color palettes play with that contrast. There really should be a holiday, which is, yellow blue, the anti-Christmas or something like the ortho Christmas or something like that. So every color is a coordinate in that space, which is called the CLab space. And it has like very, very nice, convenient properties, which is that the, geometric distance between the points in that space correspond to the number of just noticeable differences. Now, it doesn't seem to be the case that you can do these for sense. Or rather, you can do it, but A, it hasn't been done, and B, you will probably not get a Euclidean space. And even if you get a Euclidean space, it's going to be a very high dimensional one. So, there's a good number of studies. There's a lot of research, a lot of, arguments in this space. What I've seen in the literature is that there is at least a broad consensus that, the number of dimensions in scent, if we assume a Euclidean space, is at least 30, but most likely at least 300. So like 30 would be like people who are like very, very optimistic about, the dimensionality of scent. Optimistic in the sense of like how easy it's to understand and model. So, I mean, as far as I know, there's no, like serious researcher who says like the state space of scent has like less than 30 dimensions. But yeah, no, most researchers, yeah, probably about like 300. I think that, methodologically and conceptually, it's just kind of like radically misguided to try to find, just the core dimensional primitives of scent. Why? Because I think that the state space is actually not Euclidean. I mean, and yes, actually you can parameterize non-Euclidean spaces, but it's not necessarily the most insightful or clear or, practical way of doing it. Just as, parameterizing a hyperbolic space, but especially a space that has irregular geometry. So it's not even the case, I think, that scents are, in a hyperbolic space. It's something much more interesting. Is that some regions are hyperbolic, some regions are Euclidean, some regions are spherical, and even the topology in some regions may be non-trivial. Why do I think those? So, because there are hints. There are very powerful. So here's one example. So if you combine citral, pinene, and vanillin, which are like, 3 pure molecules, 3 aroma chemicals, that mixture will be what we call at QRI multiphasic, meaning that it's not going to congeal into just one scent gestalt. It's going to be kind of this like flickering mess that goes from one type to another. It's kind of like, oh, well, it's kind of like sour now, and it's kind of like piney, and hold on a second, it's kind of vanilla, and like it just alternates. It doesn't blend into a uniform thing. But if then you add something like linalool, which is kind of what creates the reverby, narcotic, ethereal quality of lavender. Or you add something like ambroxan, which is like a beautifully soft scent. Lucatruin actually described ambroxan as the most beautiful scent of all, which is, of course, saying something. You know what happens? It smooths out these phases of scent, and they stop competing with one another, and they become a unified gestalt. Completely strange. Perhaps a much more familiar example would be something like the orange Julius or orange creamsicle, where kind of this like piercing and sharp quality of orange becomes like soft, creamy, and smooth when you add vanilla and kind of like milky notes, lactone notes. So that shows that the shape, gets transformed. The shape of the wave, the way in which it impacts you, what's called the envelope of the scent, gets transformed. It's not only that you get like the linear addition between them, you get a transformation, you get some kind of strange interaction. Okay, so if you start like to model that in terms of just noticeable differences, you will realize that the presence of ambroxan or the presence of linalool all of a sudden seems to reduce the granularity in the just noticeable differences of the combination of the other scents. Or, for example, you also have valence inversions. Like sometimes there are like two scents that smell really good together, but when you combine them, they smell really bad. And the other way around. I can give you some very concrete examples. In some cases, for specific, citrus scents and for specific lavender scents, this is not universal. Another one is like eucalyptus and vanilla, for example. If you combine those two, um, each of them can smell really good on their own, but together there's like a strange, disharmonious tension and kind of like dirty, mixed up, kind of strange stress that arises out of those. Very strange. It's very strange. And likewise, like unpleasant scents sometimes when they're combined can produce something quite remarkable. For example, well, sometimes some sulfuric scents, eggy type of scents, together with kind of like cheesy, rotten scents, something like valeric acid. Yeah, sometimes when you combine, they actually can, the emergent gestalt transforms them from like, oh my gosh, this is like rotten, to like, this is some kind of like exotic but kind of appealing type of food. So that also happens, right, in the status of scent, which was kind of like these indicators that like, oh my god, like this is not a regular space. This is a strange space with a strange geometry. Now, a psychonaut once asked to DMT entities, can you tell me something insightful about the state space of sense? And well, that person was expecting something like, well, I will see a display of hyperbolic state space representation or something like that, or some kind of hyperdimensional rendering of the state space of scent. And nothing like that happened. Instead, the DMT entity told them, are you sure that the state space of sense encompasses only one Qualia variety? In other words, is this perhaps a composite of Qualia varieties as opposed to just one? Well, this is just a riddle, right? Like, of course, the DMT entity didn't actually explain, like, okay, what are the components? But, after thinking about it, it really does seem to be the case that scents actually have three Qualia varieties kind of mixed up together that create a synesthetic gestalt. What are they? They are flavor, they're tactile synesthetic elements, and there are character impact. So, first of all, flavor would be something like lemony, rosy, woody, herbal. Very, very concrete, kind of like unmistakable identities with particular vibrational qualities. It's similar to kind of like in sound, you have like piano notes and violin or a particular person's voice. That would be kind of the equivalent of the flavor in the context of sound. Then you have tactile elements, which is very peculiar. In fact, in scents, you have things such as mint, which is literally cooling, and this is not metaphorical. It's not just kind of like, well, I'm making some kind of analogy. Like, no. You actually have kind of like a literal cooling effect. And, physiologically, this actually has to do with the fact that some of those molecules that are associated with mint and related compounds can raise the threshold for the activation of cold receptors. And so it's not that it's actually cooling, it's not cooling your nose. Rather, it is tricking the neurons in your nose into thinking that the environment is colder than it is. And of course, a lot of those effects, a lot of the things that neurons do is actually detect differences, changes, as opposed to just absolute values. And so, yeah, as you change the threshold, it's like, oh my gosh, this is getting colder, right? So you get that effect. Another kind of like very tactile classic example would be aldehydes. So here's where, for example, Chanel number 5 comes into the foreground, because Chanel number 5 is like one of the first perfumes that made full-blown use of aldehydes. I mean, innovative in perfumery, of course, at the time. But yeah, aldehydes are fascinating. Actually, they cause kind of like these like prickly, spiky quality. And physiologically, that is because they're stimulating the trigeminal nerve. Now, I don't recommend actually in your scent journey, if you ever, start making perfumes yourself, I don't recommend you start by mixing a bunch of aldehydes. Why? because they're very difficult to dose. And if you put more aldehydes than you're supposed to, it can give you really bad headaches, actually. So, embarrassing anecdote, but yeah, I think the first time I ever tried using aldehydes while making perfumes, I got like a headache that lasted for like a day and a half, and not good. Uh, so you've got to, it's not just a matter of diluting them, like 1/1,000. Sometimes for like aldehydes, you need to dilute them like, 1/1,000,000 or 1/1,000,000,000 and really work your way up. So be careful, be careful there. Even something like Chanel number 5, which, relative to kind of the sense that I was exploring those days, they have like a relatively minuscule amount of aldehydes. Well, a lot of people get headaches from it. And, to be completely honest, is not an accident. It's because it's actually stimulating your trigeminal nerve. So, yeah, that's just another example of how scents have kind of like a tactile element to them. But then the third component that scents have is they also have what Luca Turin describes as character impact. And character impact, the analogy with sound would be kind of like signal processing effects that you add on top of sounds. Things such as reverb or echoes or filters, like low pass filter, high pass filters, things like that. You can do amazing things with filters, right? And you can do amazing things with kind of this broad range of signal processing tricks. To give you an example, you could take somebody's conversation where maybe one person had like they were speaking very loud or something, and with very high pitch or something that is like irritating. Again, like one of those like tactile effects now in the domain of audio. Kind of like, very screechy sounds, for example, or like a bass can have kind of like a haptic component to it. So in audio as well. Yeah, essentially you also have the analogy. Well, with signal processing tricks, you can take that out, right? Like you can cut out all of the high frequencies or something like that. Maybe even stranger, more, trippy and fascinating. You can add a special kind of reverb that will blend the voices of both persons, right? Or actually, if you add in a reverb, you can cancel out a lot of dissonance. When in the presentation about the symmetry theory of valence to Robin Carhart Harris, you can watch on the YouTube channel, the QRI YouTube channel. Like I showed, for example, some baby cries, which are like very dissonant, versus baby cries with a lot of reverb. And yeah, just like smooth. It's kind of like a baby in some infinite tunnel. Like it smooths out the unpleasant dissonances there. Well, I think it's the same with scents. Adding ambroxan or adding like linalool can, in many cases, smooth out kind of like the unpleasant interactions between scents, right? So all of that led us at QRI to conclude that the state space of scent is irregular, right? It has like irregular geometry and maybe even strange topology, and it's definitely not just a Euclidean space. So I thought of that perhaps the way to showcase this in the most beautiful, generative, and powerful way would be to conceptualize of scents as kind of like entities that have special effects, right? So it's not just like, oh, I'm choosing one color in color space or something like that, or I'm choosing like a frequency, in the space of sound. It's more like I'm choosing a Pokemon, I'm choosing a magical creature, a creature that has interesting powers. It can freeze you, or it can give you energy, or it can, cool you down. It can warm you, it can electrify you. It can, all of these like interesting effects. So, and it's completely non-trivial, right? Like, the example I was using is something like, if all you've ever seen are like the basic type Pokemons, well, I don't know very much about Pokemon, so please don't. Can imagine, Pokemon fans on the comments. It's like, that's not how Pokemons work. It's like, okay, fine. It's an analogy, I'm kind of like taking the 80-20 of Pokemon as a concept, getting the most out of it without getting too deep into it, you know? So, yeah, okay, so imagine you've only ever found, you know, Charmander, Bulbasaur, and and Squirtle. So, you know, a fire Pokemon, a water Pokemon, and a um, herb Pokemon, a grass Pokemon, right? Based on that information, would you be able to infer that there is a Pikachu, that there is an electric Pokemon? Like, no way. You know, this is coming out of the blue. It's like a completely new category, right? So, or a psychic, or like ghost fairy Pokemon? You know, what's up with those? Those are totally strange and unexpected, right? Again, it's not just like, you know, finding a coordinate just by doing linear combinations of known state space. Is like finding exotic creatures with exotic powers, right? So that is why we call them magical creatures. Also, you know, another inspiration is Daniel Ingram of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha fame. Also has a really fun article about Pokemon Go. So essentially, he's a little bit concerned that the fact that, you know, Pokemons is kind of like this, you know, slavery relationship that you may have with them. And you use them to fight against each other. It's kind of violent and, you know, strange. So he thinks that, you know, whatever you pay attention to gets energized, whatever relationship you develop with imaginary beings is kind of leaves a footprint in consciousness, right? It's kind of like a groove. You know, and in that sense, you know, if you have kind of like these like possessive relationship with the imaginary beings that you interact with on Pokemon Go, or, you know, any other Pokemon, Digimon, whatever it may be, Tamagotchis, whatever, this possessive kind of like clinging ownership, you know, quality of consciousness may actually be kind of harmful for you and for others. You're not necessarily cultivating the best qualities of consciousness, right? So he imagined that maybe in the future we will have some kind of video game where you interact with beautiful tantric deities for the benefit of, you know, developing skillful qualities, and for them to show you the intrinsic nature of reality, of consciousness, of existence, and help you reduce suffering, right? So that's a very beautiful vision. I was very inspired by reading that little article. And so, you know, kind of like putting those things together. Okay, you know, magical creatures in the state space of scent. Let's find these kind of like interesting spaces, you know, that produce interesting, nonlinear, unexpected, special effects. And not approach them with kind of this possessive, you know, ownership mindset, but rather think of them as if they are teachers that are revealing to you hidden properties of consciousness. And, you know, with this, they can actually help you kind of like escape the matrix, so to speak, you know, escape the limitations of your mind. You know, if you're too stuck in some kind of like neurotic pattern, or you're too stuck in politics, you're too stuck in like unhelpful, you know, whatever, you know, family dynamics or dynamics at work or whatever, you can always rely on the magical creatures to say like, no, that's not all there is. There's also this inherent shade of consciousness. And sure, it may seem kind of irrelevant at the time, but really it's kind of like an escape, it's an opening from the constraints of your consciousness. I think that can be really beautiful, very generative. And I think, you know, may even expand what we call it, the dimensionality of your consciousness, right? Like if you're stuck in a particular dynamic, it's kind of like there's a dimensional collapse where everything becomes black and white. Everything becomes like in favor of this idea or this person, or against this idea or this person. There's no flexibility. There's no opening to say like, wait, that dimension is also there. There's also this possibility, and that, and that, and that. So the magical creatures that I'm we're presenting here are ideally also helping you find these new dimensions to expand the dimensionality of your consciousness and not feel so trapped, not feel so trapped. So, with all of that said, let's get into the various magical creatures. Now, okay, QRI as an organization, of course, it's a non-profit. Ridiculous, right? Ridiculous that we would, have a non-profit to study consciousness in such an open-ended way, investigate, the hyperbolic geometry of DMT experiences, or, map out the jhanas, or trying to identify the mathematics of valence. Crazy, right? Insane. Thankfully, some people have been very generous in supporting us, but, in the long term, obviously, we need to find a way to make this a sustainable enterprise so you can continue to get, fascinating, mind-expanding opening that hopefully will be very helpful for, again, Qualia mastery, right? Like making all of these Qualia varieties accessible to everybody, expanding your consciousness and reducing suffering. I guess also QRI is very strange in that we also do research and advocacy for very crazy things like anti-tolerance drugs, like ibogaine for chronic pain, microdosed ibogaine to reverse, tolerance to painkillers, or DMT for cluster headaches. Yeah, I mean, you actually require a crazy organization that really doesn't care about a lot of kind of like standard optics to be able to say these things and develop this technology and push it into the world to massively, hopefully massively reduce suffering. So, yeah, we've got to figure out how to make this a self-sustaining enterprise. I am definitely of the mind that we shouldn't, turn it into a for-profit, because then all the startup incentives, come into play, and like then you're constrained by kind of the financial needs of the organization. I've seen a lot of startups kind of compromise in their core values for the sake of keeping, the employees, and for the sake of essentially not going bankrupt and things like that. I don't want that to happen to QRI. I want it to be kind of like a solid, reliable, like we know our values. We're going to keep our values. It doesn't matter, the financial constraints. I would rather have QRI and then compromise on its values. So, yeah. Anyway, all of that is kind of like, a short appeal to, yes, magical creatures. It's a fundraising campaign, okay? At the same time, though, I don't want to gatekeep this Qualia, right? So, of course, in the long term, with workshops and, sharing the formulas and so on, I want these to be accessible to everybody, obviously, and write scientific papers about it and so on. But for right now, except for one of them, the formula will be proprietary, and we will give them to you in exchange of a donation to QRI. But okay, so there's the 3 tiers. First, if you donate $100, we will give you 3 what we call quote unquote basic types, but actually they're really cool. I mean, they're really, really interesting, which are essentially, basic type is a kind of magical creature that does exist in the wild. You can find it in some perfumes, you can find it in some essential oils, but only at QRI, because of the aesthetic lens and the focus on studying the state space of consciousness, we have actually, the motivation and the capacity to kind of like purify that effect and intensify it so that you can experience it in a very, very clear way, right? So those are like the basic types. For $500, I know, okay, this is like maybe inaccessible for a lot of you, but again, we're trying to make this research sustainable. For $500, you will also get, even for the first one, you will also get like QRI sticker, but also you will get like t-shirts, QRI t-shirts. So, the classic one, and then like the one that contains, again, like the state space of 2-dimensional symmetries, which is called the wallpaper symmetry groups, the t-shirt that I'm wearing. So, and that one will give you access to 2 rare type of magical creatures, which are essentially scents that actually identify a fundamentally new, type of qualia from scents. And I'll explain what they are in a second. And then finally, if you donate / you buy $20,000, you will get a mystical type magical creature, which are the kind of magical creatures that expand your mind to new Qualia varieties that are of such profound significance that essentially they're foreshadowing the properties of consciousness after the phase transition of the post-Darwinian evolutionary era of consciousness. And I'll get to that. Okay, so the starter pack, the basic types. So there's 3 of them. First of all, we have Fearless. So I've talked about Fearless. You'll get a very nice, little bottle. I should explain. It's gonna be, a little bit more beautiful bottle. But essentially, Fearless is a scent that has been optimized to cancel out and minimize fear vibrations. Actually, if you pay attention to the phenomenology of fear, it's not like just a flavor, it's actually a vibratory quality. And I experienced, it's very common in meditation retreats to experience quite a bit of fear. I experienced quite a bit of fear on my first meditation retreat. And my subconscious, came up with that scent. It sounds ridiculous, right? I was meditating about like 8 hours a day. And I was experiencing some fear. And then my subconscious was, hey, buddy, hey, buddy, I'm noticing that you're experiencing some fear. Maybe like Clippy or something, right? I'm noticing you're experiencing some fear. How about this scent? And how about this scent? How about this? Is that helpful? Okay, and the first thing that came to mind, was actually hallucinating the scent of banana. I don't know. Have you ever smelled a banana and felt fear? It's very peculiar, right? It's like kind of like so orthogonal to fear, and it's like sweet and it has kind of this creaminess to it. Well, and after banana, jasmine, vanilla, mint, So then I went and tried to combine these things and it didn't work actually. It took me kind of like 3 kind of like attempts at different times in my journey of exploring the state space of sense for me to actually be able to replicate what I had hallucinated during the meditation retreat. And that was like Fearless 3.0. Then I kind of like developed it further and then I called it Open Fearless. And Open Fearless is open for 2 reasons. First of all, it is open because the formula is going to be made available. This is one scent that you can actually replicate at home. You don't need to pay the $100. It's kind of like open cola, where actually the formula behind it. But it's also open in the sense of open individualism, which is the philosophical idea that we're all one consciousness. So Open Fearless, it's meant to cancel out not only regular, typical animal level, fear vibrations. It's also meant to cancel out mystical and spiritual type fear, the fear of the universe being meaningless, for example, or that we're all alone, or that we're just snapshots of experience, trapped in space-time. All of those like kind of like bombers that you can experience. Fearless is crafted to reduce the bite, take the bite out of them. So, and the magical creature that we're using in order to symbolize it is this. It's kind of like a very, very fun, very fun golden retriever. And of course, the color palette of it is green and yellow and white. Very friendly colors. And the texture of it is essentially a combination of 3 core facets, which are very friendly, which is sweet, creamy, and fresh. Very fresh, very alive, very, the opposite of kind of like stuck and the opposite of like, strained and afraid. Then we have Dust Devil. So, okay, you may have heard of Terre de Hermes, you know? It's a very good scent, you know? It's extremely well done. It's made with Isoe Super and Vetiver. And it got, you know, it gives you this sense of kind of a dusty. It has this dusty, powdery quality. It's very well done. However, it's not very broad spectrum. By that I mean it's just one note, one type of dustiness. You see what I mean? But there's other kinds of dustiness. You know, for example, there is violet. Violet, not all violets, but definitely Parma violets, which is a sweet that you find in the UK. And some essential oils of violet, like this one. The brand is Sedbosa. They are very powdery. Yeah, fantastically powdery. It's kind of like, okay, other powdery things are like talc, cedarwood, sandalwood, turmeric, some kinds of pears. What's up with that, right? That's kind of like one of those like magical, strange effects. Again, like if you had never experienced any powdery scent, you wouldn't be able to infer out of the blue. It's like, yes, of course, there's this missing spot in the state space. There's got to be something here. It's like, no, completely out of the blue. It's kind of, again, you know, a ghost or psychic type Pokemon. You wouldn't have been able to infer it. So what I did was figure out how to capture the full spectrum of powderiness. You know, it's kind of like, let's not just only focus on cedarwood type powdery or violet or turmeric type powdery. Let's find a way to combine them. And here's the thing, and this is very interesting, and I think like at some point I really hope to figure this out, like why this is the case. But it is the case that if you combine powdery scents together, oftentimes the emergent combination is not powdery. I mean, it's kind of like if you combine two kinds of powders together, sometimes the combination is actually pretty solid, you know, or viscous, or something else happens that it stops being so misty and volatile. You know, maybe the grains kind of like lock into each other and you get a gridlock between the two types of powders or something like that. Well, so it was actually pretty challenging to identify the precise combination of powdery scents that will not only keep the powderiness, but in fact synergize to create an even more powdery effect. So I was pretty proud, very happy with Dust Devil. So this is the kind of like magical creature. Yeah, you know. Oh, the other thing too. When I made this scent, every time I worked on it, I put on as a part of kind of the soundtrack. I often like use music to work with scents. Is the soundtrack of things like Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I don't think this is a copyright violation, is it? Like, ooh, ooh. That song? Well, and other kind of like spaghetti western soundtracks. Yeah, that's kind of like the vibe, which is like, you know, like tumbleweeds and very dry environment and whiskey neat and dust devils, you know, literal dust devils. So it's very dry, very dusty, very grainy, as it were. So that is Dust Devil. Very interesting. It has a tiny bit of a tangerine to kind of like add a dry citrusy lift to it, but you know, that's the core. Okay, so the third basic type is Glacial gumdrop. So this is the magical creature associated with it. So it's kind of like a gummy bear, but made of a very, very cold, but still very gummy substance. So first of all, as I was explaining, you know, like minty type molecules, they have the habit of essentially increasing the threshold for the activation of cold receptors. It's such a trope to say something like Glacier Freeze. You know, this is one Gatorade flavor. I wonder actually what it tastes like. Glacier Freeze. And yeah, sure, it has kind of a cooling effect. And this one is called cool blue. Oh my god, it's so tropey. So tropey. Oh yeah, it's different. I think it's not as cold actually. Not as cold as the other one. But you know, so tropey, right? Like all of these perfumes, all of these like room fresheners, whatever, is like cold, like cool breeze, you know, fresh spring, glaciers, snow, icy, glacier, blue, cool, whatever. You know, there's like all of those like terms. Cool water. Cool water would be an example. This is an aromatic fougere that has definitely like powerful minty elements. Oh no, it's actually, yeah, kind of like Carvone. Spearmint is a spearmint kind of type space. I have a couple other ones here, like Eternity, Air, you know, whatever. Versace Pour Homme, just Versace Pour Homme, has kind of like a very fresh, cold facet to it, like freezing effect. What else? Oh Fresh, and by Versace, and Versace Eros. For men. Actually, this is very nice. This is very, very nice. It's kind of like an amber or aromatic fougere with a mint component. I like it a lot. But here's the thing, you know, none of these are A, optimized for the most cold possible, but B, they don't have anything like a gummy quality to them. So that was for me a discovery. You know, that's one of the like, bam, actually this is like a special effect out there. Where did I put it? Oh yeah, here. I'm actually gonna smell it for sake of having it like very fresh in my mind. Literally fresh. Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, it's like, it's kind of like it's gummy, like a gummy bear, but in the olfactory bulb. It's like there's some kind of like gumminess that you experience here. It's a trip. Like, I don't know. I'm very excited for people to try it and write a review about it. It's like, you know, it's not like the most beautiful scent or whatever, but it's just like very interesting, you know? So again, Glacial gumdrop is so friendly. It's such a friendly scent. It's unbelievably like, it's not gonna hurt you. It's like so friendly. Anyway, so those are the basic types. You know, they're kind of like harnessing properties that exist in other. Oh yeah, for gumminess. I was gonna say, there are gummy flavors that you may have experienced, which are marigold. Well, it's the same flower as you know, the orangey kind of like petals that you use in a Dia de los Muertos altar. Yeah, it has kind of like a gummy quality. And sometimes, you know, some perfumes have that note. But again, it's not optimized for that. Like most perfumes will have a very subtle quality of that. Whereas Glacial gumdrop is very optimized for being like both very cold and very gummy. So it's a trip. I'm very happy with it. Aranone is like a type of a musk. And then some bergamots. I would say like maybe 10% of the bergamots that I've smelled. So if you smell bergamot, chances are you haven't experienced this quality. But some bergamots are very gummy. I don't know. It's kind of the texture of like a condom. I don't know why. But anyway, okay. Now I have also like Gatorades to drink. So those are those. Now, for the low donation of $500, yes, we're gonna get like rare types, which are like essentially kinds of scents where I have never seen that effect ever in any, you know, essential oil or perfume. And they're also like emergent. It's not like there's like just one aroma chemical that will have them. The first one is called Friesen. And this is the magical entity associated with it. So Friesen, you know, it's kind of like the hair. Yeah, it's kind of... So what is Friesen? For the non-English native speakers like myself, I didn't know what Friesen was. But essentially, it's a kind of like this strange effect where you experience like such beautiful music, for example, that you have kind of in Spanish is like la piel se te pone como de gallina, like chicken, like is hair raising, right? Now this is not exactly that, because it's a scent, synesthetic effect. It's kind of in between that and ASMR. And ASMR itself is a synesthetic effect, right? It's like sound and tactile, right? So this would be kind of like the ASMR equivalent, but for scent. And it's not quite dusty either, and it's not quite dry. It's like there's something, I would say, kind of like in the meridian, kind of around here, that kind of like does like this, kind of like a sanding of your energy body in that part. Very strange, very strange. Totally a peculiar effect. And I think it could probably be used in perfumery. Like, in other words, like some perfumes could like use this as a facet. And yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. This also smells of a couple other things. It has like honeysuckle as one note. It has like bergamot as a note, but is optimized for that effect. Being completely candid, I think there's probably ways to make it even more of that, like make it more Friesen. But that's as good as I've been able to, and I've put a good number of hours on like trying to like, okay, how do I make this work as best as possible? I would love to see if like any professional perfumist like tries to improve upon it. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. Like, if ASMR is a very big hit, right? Like maybe Friesen in scent might become a very big hit itself. So that's that. Now we're getting close to the end. Eau de Cologne vide, meaning cologne of emptiness. An emptiness cologne. So back to the idea that like the statements of scent has like this, it's kind of like this enmeshment of these three Qualia varieties. You have the character impact, again, which is kind of the signal processing effects. So some perfumes have a very, very heavy, character impact. One example is Calvin Klein 1, which is very, very musky. It has a lot of, dihydromyrcenol, and has a bunch of Hedonium and some like musks. Yeah, it's so soft. It's unbelievably soft. Even though it's like citrusy, some people describe it as like, oh yeah, the classic lemon scent of the 90s. It's like, no. The idea that this is like a lemony thing, is kind of like talking about like the crazy, synthesizing infected mushroom, Spangle type of music as like instrumental or something like that. It's like, no, that's not the essence here. Actually, Calvin Klein 1 is like mostly a very powerful reverby, narcotic, musky quality that happens to have a little bit of lemon, right? That's actually what is going on in here, and it lasts forever. Like if you put it on you don't notice it very much after a while, but like you put it on your clothes and you leave them somewhere for a while, like you come back like a week later when you're gonna do your laundry, and like it still smells like CK1. Lasts forever. So that would be an example of like very, very heavy character impact. Another very heavy character impact is Le Male. Very classic, very well known, with a very erotic type of shape. So this one, they tend to describe it as like vanilla, mint, lavender. But again, that really doesn't describe it. I mean, what's more going on is that you have like a ton of galaxolide and tonalide, which are musks. Very clean, very, very clean musks. They don't have kind of like a lot of other nuances. And yeah, there's like such a heavy signal processing kind of like effect on top of it. It's really startling. I remember I had no idea how to place, Le Male, but like once you smell it, it's like, oh yeah, that's the Le Male. If you're gonna get a sample of Le Male, I would recommend experiencing it, and also of CK1 to know what I'm talking about. Again, like you might require a bit kind of like an intention, to understand the state space of consciousness for this to like really feel as significant as I think it really is. In terms of like popular culture, I would say that a good kind of like example of a magical creature kind of in that space would be maybe Forky from Toy Story 4, which by the way is the thing that actually led me to learn about Frank Yang, the enlightened infinite bra, which I guess is a technical term now. But, this is kind of like you're taking emptiness, and you're decorating it, right? In the case of these ones, okay, there's actually quite a bit of flavor, relatively quite a bit of flavor. But if you go even deeper and you do what I did here, which is Eau de Cologne vide, emptiness cologne, essentially it's something that is not like those where actually they have like the character impact is like very low notes. Here I'm actually using character impact that is very high pitch, high and middle pitch. So it's kind of like heart notes and top notes of character impact. So it's kind of like electric and sour and intense and sweet, but also about nothing. It's like decorating nothingness. It's a very peculiar effect, and that's why it's kind of like a rare type. Maybe the closest is this. It's called eccentric molecule 1, I think, and 2, which are basically just ambroxan and isoe superisomers. Also pretty popular. But again, those are like low frequency character impacts. This is like middle and high frequency character impacts. I've never seen something like that. I've never smelled something like that. And yeah, the name follows, the age-old tradition of naming perfumes with kind of like mystical terms like Nirvana and Truth by Calvin Klein. This bottle, right? The truth is skewed, as it turns out. Yeah, I mean the scents of these are good, but they're not as profound, revealing, extraordinary. Yeah, so those are the rare types. I should mention that in time we're gonna expand the number of magical creatures if this works. I'm gonna do it regardless, right? But like maybe we'll make them available. All right. So, and this is the character, right? It's kind of like this rainbowy decoration of emptiness. For the low amount, very good value for money of $20,000, you will get Hedonium shockwave, which is, Hedonium is matter and energy optimized for maximum bliss, like perfect bliss. This is not a shallow pleasure. This is not just sexual orgasm. This is not just, a beautiful song. This is like optimized for profound meaning and joy and union with the divine and love of such grade that makes you, get on your knees and and cry, and like you're just totally out of it because like you didn't know this existed. I am very curious what people will think about it. Some people have reviewed it. I know that like somebody who practices jhanas reviewed it as kind of a hybrid between the third jhana and cocaine. It's kind of like the third jhana, the piece of the third jhana, but like it hits you, but in a loving, fun way. And Lucas, who recently had, from the Mew podcast, recently had a podcast with him. He smelled it and he really, really liked it. Overwhelmingly, everybody I showed it to says they really like it. I don't know anybody who didn't like it because I spent so much time, optimizing it. Like the idea is that like it hits you, and it hits you with very clean positive valence that is like very undeniably like, okay, this is good. It may not be, MDMA, but like maybe it's as good as it gets in the olfactory domain. Okay, I would be fascinated to find somebody who hates it actually. But kind of the trick here is not so much. It's not so much just like putting things that I know people will absolutely love, as much as using all kinds of like, again, signal processing tricks to make sure that it has like no dissonance whatsoever. And yeah, I mean, what I can mention about it without giving away the formula is that it has essentially kind of like, it's very, it's kind of like sweet, sour, and extremely soft for how sweet and sour it is. And it's very refreshing as well. So here's what the entity looks like, the magical creature. You can see it doesn't even have a face, right? It's like just this impersonal kind of like wave of peace and pleasure and well-being and mystical feelings. That's why it's a mystical type magical creature, kind of like a biblically accurate angel, right? It's not like something that looks like, oh my gosh, that's a Pikachu or something like that. It's more kind of like, oh my gosh, this is like a new kind of energy, a new phase of consciousness. And yes, it is a magical creature, but doesn't need to have eyes. It doesn't need to have sensory organs because it's in a different phase, of matter and energy. All right, so let me smell it. It's gonna be so sad if at some point I just can't find again one of the ingredients of it. I mean, it hits the spot. It really does. I am very curious what other perfumists will say. I think it's possible that they will say like, I'm being ridiculous, but that could be either because they're shocked and they just don't want to admit to themselves that somebody solved perfumery and it's just so good, so pure pleasure that they're in denial, or that I'm an amateur and just overhyping a pretty random Qualia variety. And priors would say it's number 2, but we'll see. We will see. We will see. Okay, well, that's about it. So magical creatures, you can pre-order. We aim to have them mailed early February. You will get them. If you buy Hedonium Shockwave, we will mail that first. You'll get it pretty soon. And I'm just gonna conclude with kind of like a brief discussion about kind of like tiers of heaven. We want heaven to be accessible to absolutely everybody, every sentient beings, all sentient beings. It really should be kind of like a birthright for any sentient, any sentient. So, but yeah, I mean, as it turns out, you really need to expand your mind to understand how deep heaven realms can go, right? So, Buddhism has some like really interesting accounts here where like there are kind of like heavens even already within kind of like the realm of desire would be kind of like, getting what we want within the realm of desire, which still have like subtle clinging and suffering, And then there's kind of like beautiful, heaven-like realms like the first 4 jhanas that still have form, still have like sensory input and sensory qualities, but are devoid of desire. They're like true kind of like escapes. They're true oasis of consciousness that have just the joy and love and happiness undiluted. They can still be very sensorially rich, but they have a unification of the mind that is just so delicious, so fragrant and beautiful. And then there are the formless realms, right? Like actually valence doesn't require kind of like classic sensory inputs. You can have like the realm of infinite space or the realm of infinite consciousness or the realm of nothingness, neither perception nor non-perception. Now, I actually think that, okay, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that there is such a thing as like olfactory silence. And in that sense, yeah, every Qualia variety actually would have their corresponding equivalent of the 5th jhana, which is, the sphere of infinite space. The same for the sphere of infinite consciousness, because you can be conscious of or conscious within a particular Qualia variety, even though it may actually not be instantiating any particular value. So even then, yeah, I strongly suspect actually that there is a formless realms associated with olfactory qualia. And it will have like a different geometry actually. And then then there's also the pure lands, which is heaven realms where there is complete freedom from suffering and there is an understanding about the nature of consciousness and beautiful, love and altruism and desire for helping all sentient beings. So that's something we can aspire to. I know it's ridiculous. Sounds completely ridiculous and trivial, but I think it's hopefully a step, in the direction of pursuing these explorations of consciousness, figuring out things such as what's going on with 5-MeO-DMT, what's going on with MDMA, and figuring out how to make them freely accessible for everybody. So with that as a beautiful desire and intention for the next year, thank you so much for joining. And again, thank you so much for joining us in this journey of discovery of consciousness. I'm very grateful to all of you, to people at QRI, everybody who has contributed in any way over its history. And more recently, people like Hunter and Crystal and Anders and Maggie, David Pierce, Marcin and Chris Percy. Very substantial help. I could provide a long list of people. I'll do that at some point, but again, just want to express my gratefulness and towards Qualia Mastery. Qualia Mastery for everybody. All right, infinite bliss, everybody. Take care. Happy New Year. Until next time. Ciao.